Hey everybody. So if you follow this channel, you probably know that I am a huge fan of physical hockey. I love fights, I love big hits. Any sort of physicality and violence makes the game so much better, so much more fun to watch, really more interesting. And there's no doubt that over the last few years, hockey has gotten a lot softer. There's not as much hitting anymore, there's way less fighting. And it's led to a lot of really boring games that have put me right to sleep. But there are still some fights. There were around 280 fights in the league last year. I forget the exact number. I used to know it, but there are still fights. There's still hits. Things do happen, and it's really, really awesome when it does. And today we're going to look at who I think are going to be the 5 toughest teams in the NHL next year. So basically I just went through their rosters and picked the teams that I think have the toughest rosters and toughest lineups, and kind of see who's going to lead the way in the physicality department next year. Before we get to this started, I just want to say, if you're not yet a subscriber to this channel, please hit that subscribe button. As long as you're a fan of hockey and a fan of the NHL, there are videos here for you. Whether you follow a certain team or if you follow the league as a whole, there are videos on this channel that you will enjoy, so please hit that subscribe button. Now, here is my list of the 5 toughest teams. First up, the Florida Panthers. Florida was by far the toughest team last year. They blew everyone away as far as fighting majors were concerned. It wasn't even close between them and second place. And I expect them to lead the league in fights again this year. Florida, Michael Haley obviously leads the way. We'll see where he fits into that lineup this year. I'm not sure if Haley is going to be an everyday player this season like he was last year. He might be an extra forward, but he certainly will get in there when injuries happen, or depending on who Florida is playing, they might want to get Haley in there. Haley led the league in fights last year. He had 22. The next closest person had 13. So he blew everyone away as far as fights last year. I don't see him getting to 20 again. I don't think he's going to play enough games to get to 20 again. But I do still think he can be in that 14-15 range. And, Florida is still going to, I think, be the toughest team because they have Michael Haley. They also have Alex Petrovic, who fights quite a bit, and then a slew of other players who are all willing to drop the gloves at 2, 3, 4 times a year. Guys like Jamie McGinn, Colton Sevier, Derek McKenzie, Aaron Ekblad goes a couple times a year. There's very strong team toughness in Florida. Haley leads the way and is the clear fighter, and then after that they have a whole bunch of guys who are all willing to drop the gloves. So I expect Florida to be the toughest team again this year, and I think it's going to be closer than it was last year, but I don't see any team having more fights than the Panthers. Next up, the Edmonton Oilers. Edmonton has a very tough team by today's NHL standards. Zach Kassian leads the way. He's very, very tough and always willing to drop the gloves. Milan Lucic, obviously, still a power forward, still a big body who can bring a little bit of offense. Used to bring a lot of offense. Now he brings a little bit of offense, but he's still a physical player and always gets in a decent number of fights every year. Jujhar Khaira, he burst onto the scene as a fourth liner last year and ended up fighting quite a few times. So as long as he continues with that, he's going to add a good number to Edmonton's fight total. And also not listed because I don't have room, but Darnell Nurse is a kid on the back end, young defenseman, but a very tough kid, and always, he always gets in a few scraps a year. So I expect Edmonton to be, pretty close to the top as far as fighting majors are concerned. Next up, this is a team that usually is not near the top fight-wise, but the Minnesota Wild have put together a pretty tough roster. Obviously, they have Marcus Foligno again this year. He's always willing to go. They've added quite a few depth forwards, notably. Well, not just forwards, on defense too. They've added J.T. Brown, who's always, he's a pretty tough guy, and he, especially in Tampa Bay, he was pretty much Tampa Bay's main fighter when he was there. Matt Hendricks, who has throughout his career been willing to drop the gloves. Greg Patterin, who can drop the gloves on the back end. They still have Nate Prosser as a seventh defenseman. He'll go a time or two a year. And Nick Seeler had the fight of the year last year with Luke Witkowski. They just threw bombs back and forth. And then he fought again in the playoffs against Winnipeg. And Seeler is a pretty, he's a really tough kid. And he fought quite a bit in the AHL. Now that he's a full-time NHL guy, I expect more than 2 fights from him this year. And I think he's going to be one of the tougher young defensemen in the NHL. So Minnesota, who's not usually an overly tough team, really put together a roster this year that can drop the gloves when needed. Going right along with Minnesota in the Central Division, the St. Louis Blues. St. Louis, Chris Thorburn led the way for them fighting-wise last year, and he's still on the roster this year. I don't know how much he's going to play. He's listed as an extra forward now, but assuming that he gets into the lineup, there are injuries throughout the year. Guys who are not in the opening night in the opening night lineup always find their way into the lineup. So I expect Thorburn to at least play some games, and he'll definitely be willing to scrap. Pat Maroon, they added him this offseason. He's a very, very tough guy, power forward guy. Always willing to drop the gloves and will fight pretty much anybody. They've also added Jordan Nolan as an extra forward. He's a pretty tough kid, and didn't really fight much last year, but when he was in LA, he was a very noted fighter. They also have Braden Shen, who for a skilled player is pretty tough and is one of those kind of old school type players who is definitely, even though he's a scorer and a top 6 center, he's willing to drop the gloves from time to time. On the back end, they have Joel Edmondson, who's a tough kid. They also have Robert Bortuzzo, who has dropped the gloves, from time to time in the past. So St. Louis has a pretty tough roster, and I expect them to, get in their fair share of physical altercations this season. And lastly, the Boston Bruins. Boston, this certainly isn't the big bad Bruins of the late 60s and early 70s, but they still have, by today's standard, a pretty tough roster led by Adam McQuaid and Kevin Miller on defense. Both of them are very tough guys and, fight a decent amount. They also have David Backes up front, who, if he stays healthy, he's always good for 3 or 4 scraps a year. Then they have a whole bunch of guys who will fight, a few times. Guys like Sean Corrali, Noel Acciari, Zdeno Chara can still go a time or two. Torrey Krug can drop the gloves. Chris Wagner, off-season addition. Boston doesn't have that one player that really stands out as their fighter, but they have very strong team toughness up and down the lineup and, a whole bunch of guys who are willing to drop the gloves if needed. So these are obviously not the only tough teams in the league. Teams like Calgary have tough guys. Anaheim's still pretty tough. Philadelphia. There are other teams with tough lineups in the league. These are the 5 toughest in my opinion. There are also teams. This list I did based mostly on team toughness. There are teams out there who really have only one guy. So I think of the Washington Capitals. It's Tom Wilson in Washington, and then really nobody else. But they'll still have a decent number of fights because Wilson's going to have a lot. You look at Cody McLeod with the New York Rangers. If McLeod's in the lineup, he's really it. He's their fighter, and they don't have really anyone else who fights that much. So this is more team toughness. These are the teams that I think are going to be right at the top when it comes to fighting majors this year, just because they have multiple players who are willing to drop the gloves, and they're not just relying on that one guy. So, obviously, we'll see what happens. There's really no way to predict the future. But looking at the lineups, these are who I think the toughest are. Also, you look at these players, these are their main the guys you expect to fight, kind of their main tough guys. But every team has, surprise fighters, guys who get in 1 or 2 fights a year that you didn't really see coming. I mean, look at David Pastrnak last year in Boston. And when you look at the end of the year, when you look through the list of, who fought and how many times on each team, you have your main fighters with a high number of fights, and then when you look at those guys with 1 and 2, there's a lot of them, and there's a lot of names that you really didn't know that they would fight this year. So that changes the numbers a lot too, and adds a lot of fights to the league when you get surprise fights. But yeah, I cannot wait for hockey to be back. I cannot wait for the preseason and rookie tournaments to start, because I just want to see action on the ice. So we'll see how tough the league is this year. Last year, fighting was way down, and there was not that much physicality. We'll see if it bounced back a little bit this year, if it stays around the same, or if it continues to drop even more. So we'll see what happens. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Like, comment, share, subscribe, follow on social media. Check out offthewallhockey.com. All those links in the description below. Keep spreading the word about this channel. Let's keep this thing growing. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you guys soon.